So turn there, Ephesians 2. Actually going to take another stab at the same passage that we looked at last week, because after last Sunday, this happens from time to time. I feel like, wow, there's so much more there, and I felt like I want to look at the text more, examine it more, and see more of what's there. And I don't know if it's because there were certain things in the passage that I wanted to spend more time with. Probably partly that, but also, I mean, it's so relevant for what we're going through in the world. And as has been said, we all feel this tension, the conflict. I mean, you just leave your house and you feel it, right? With neighbors, the larger community, the things going on up in Seattle. I mean, we're all just very aware of it. And I, the way I spend my weeks, I'm meeting with people, and I'm, as a pastor, counselor, I'm dealing with people's conflict regularly, and I'm often kind of in the middle of that. I feel like a referee a lot of times, and I'm trying to think my way through it and help people, and then I've got my own conflict in my mind with whether it's my family or my views on these political topics, other things. And then even in my free time, last week I found this documentary on Netflix, World War II, and I'm just glued to this. I can't escape war. Like, even for my fun, I sit and watch documentaries about warfare. And it actually occurred to me this morning. Jill and I are getting ready for church, and we're talking about this and talking about Ephesians 2. And I said, and then she added some details too, that like that is life. Like, life is war. You can't escape it. We're at war with others in our minds. We're at war small scale, large scale. We're even at war with inanimate objects. We're at war with the elements. I mean, even just to plant a garden or whatever, there's things you have to fight and work to try to survive and preserve and prolong life. That's just the way it is. We can't escape it. And we have all these endeavors that we're involved with, even with sports being kind of muted for a while for us. It's made me aware of the fact that, well, we are entertained by it, it's engaging, and it's kind of like a form of warfare. It's competition, it's battle. There are strategies involved, and it's about triumph and winning. And so it's just like, you can't escape it. And the most disturbing part of it is the internal part of it, the tension, the lack of peace, the frustration, everything that Don just talked about, and then all of you can relate to. And whether you feel more of the anger side of it or more of the anxiety, or you may be blessed to be like me, where you have kind of a perfect mix of both anger and anxiety going on all the time. It's great. So yeah, sort of a win-win thing. You can be jealous. So with all of that, right, this passage once again just puts before us God. And part of what I want to highlight this morning, hopefully a little better than last week, although I think everything that was said last week was helpful, what I want to get at this morning is the vertical part of it. Like, so how does God factor in? I want to say more about that, because in our horizontal relationships, in our warfare with other people, and with people who have a different political perspective, or people who are viewing the pandemic differently, or all that stuff, in the middle of all that, most important is what's happening vertically, which usually goes undetected. We're not even really thinking about. But this passage invites us to think about it, to think about who our Creator God is, to be reminded of His goodness to us, His kindness to us. And how, most importantly, when it comes to our war with Him, He has put an end to it. That the cross puts an end to our war with Him. God has made peace. And it is peace that we so desperately need, right? I mean, I think we're all aware of that. We so desperately need. So let's read it again. And I'm just going to show you a few portions of this passage that I think will be encouraging to you, as they have been to me. Okay, starting in verse 11. It says, "Therefore remember that formerly you, Gentiles in the flesh, who are called uncircumcision by the so-called circumcision, which is performed in the flesh by human hands. Remember that you were at that time separate from Christ, excluded from the commonwealth of Israel, strangers to the covenants of promise, having no hope, and without God in the world." Let me stop there, actually, and remind you of the distinction here, the different parties, the Jews and Gentiles. And as I said last week, I mean, you can't get two groups of people who are more different than Jews and Gentiles, separated in so many ways from one another, and even different from a lot of the other distinctions that we humanly manufacture. This distinction is kind of like a God ordained, or God kind of made this distinction himself in the ways that he worked historically. And so you have these two different groups, and Paul here is writing to people who are Gentiles, or at least mostly Gentiles. And that's why he says, hey, you Gentiles in the flesh. So you are Gentiles. Paul himself being Jewish, and he's thinking of also the Jewish people, and they're part of this. But he says, you Gentiles, you are separated. You didn't have access to the same information. You didn't have the same the detailed information that they had in the Old Testament. They didn't have the same tradition and all the practices. They were separated from that. And most importantly, he says you were, and he kind of repeats this, he says you were separate from Christ, and then later he says you were without God. So same idea, right? Christ being the second person of the Godhead. You were without God. Most importantly, you didn't have God. And so there's a sense in which, like, the Jews are viewed here as being at least closer to God. They had more access to this revelation of God, and that was not really their choice. That was God's choice. That was his doing. He revealed himself to them. And so it looks like you get the Jews closer to God and the Gentiles farther away, and that's true, and that's what Paul's saying. But interestingly, as you go along, you see that what he's really getting at here is that all people, Jews, Gentiles, are still really not united with God. We're still all separate from God. Yeah, the Jews have the covenants of promise. They have the law. He talks about the law in verse 15. They have the law. But really, both parties are separate from God. And you see it when you look in a few places. First of all, you see that the idea of being separated from God, separated from Christ, and then even though the Jews, okay, were closer, he says that he reconciled both, that Christ reconciled both in one body to God through the cross. And it was the two little words, to God, that I tripped over last week in my study and said, wait, I gotta look at that more closely. Jews needed to be reconciled to God just as much as Gentiles did. And they may have had more revelation because of what God did historically, but they needed salvation just as much as the Gentiles needed salvation. Both need salvation. Both need God to abolish the law. And so in one sense, the law was this point of distinction or point of contention between the Jews and Gentiles because the Jews took pride in the Mosaic heritage and all of that. So yes, that was a humanly, horizontally divisive factor, but more so, it was a factor in terms of it reveals, it's indicative of the separation between God and all of men. And so that's where Paul in Romans says, hey, even Gentiles, even though they don't have the law in the same way the Jews have, they still have law. Humans still have their own ways of thinking about law and exercising law, and both Jews and Gentiles need a reconciliation. Both need, this is another key word here, both need the enmity to be eliminated. And what is enmity? That's a strange word. We don't use that in our culture commonly, but the word is a strong word. It has to do with hostility. Both Jews and Gentiles need the hostility to be eliminated. And I think more of what I highlighted last week, which is a legitimate part of it, but the greater emphasis is the hostility, the enmity that is vertical, the enmity between man and God. All people, from Adam and Eve forward, we've had this war going on with God. Now, what's really hard about that is I don't, as I said earlier, I'm not often aware of that. I don't feel that, sense that. I feel more so the war with other people than war with God. But here's what's interesting. So all throughout the New Testament, there are places which say those two are absolutely joined together. In 1 John, it says, if you don't love your neighbor, if you don't love another person, that is a manifestation of your lack of love for God. You don't love God either. So all the things that go on in our lives where we find ourselves boiling over with hostility in one way or another toward other people, this passage and all throughout the New Testament is inviting us to recognize that that is an expression of our war with our Creator. That those are all representations of or symbolic of, or they signify our war with our Creator. Even though it's not immediately obvious to us that that's the case. So there's war with God really is what's underneath all of this. And all the fighting that goes on between Jew and Gentile back then, and still goes on today between those people groups, and every other division, all the disunity and disharmony you can think of that goes on in your lives individually and all around the community and society at large. I mean, all that stuff that we're all very aware of right now, underneath it all is this enmity with our Creator. And part of that is that we cannot, naturally speaking, trust that He is good, that He is taking care of us, that we have what we need. We are fighting to survive. I think, Tracy, you said it in Sunday school, and you think of it even in the natural world, where the animal kingdom, they're fighting to survive. We had, was it last week, we have this small garden in our backyard and trying to protect, so we've got bird nets over parts of it, and this family of birds were in our backyard, and all these little chicks, and Jill had said earlier she saw a hawk flying overhead, and so they were probably trying to avoid this hawk and trying to get a little food from our garden at the same time, and that's like this world of danger and threat. It's the world we live in, and there are a gazillion examples of it, but all of it speaks to this cursed status of the created order, and it all is an opportunity for us to consider the brokenness of mankind and to acknowledge, as God helps us to acknowledge, that we actually have a problem with Him. That when things happen that we don't like, even in society, things we have no control over, that frustration that just feels like, I mean, don't you feel like it's like almost, it's ready to boil over. And even when you watch the news and see other people, when there was I think Donald Trump's rally yesterday, and there's a little bit of footage of, the people outside, and of course some protesters were there, and you can just like, you feel it's like a powder keg, man. You're just like waiting for that thing to erupt. I mean, all of that human pent-up aggression and hostility. And this is saying, hey, we were at enmity with God. We were separate from God. All of us. And through Christ, God has dealt with the problem. Through Christ, He has dealt with the problem. Through the cross, it says, He reconciled both Jews and Gentiles in one body to God. In so many places in Romans and elsewhere in the New Testament, it just says, look, all are naturally speaking condemned. All are in need of God's grace. And here's what's interesting. We said one of the things that fuels the strife in our world is this: we all have this conception of the perfect, conception of what should be. And so we should ourselves to death, and we should other people to death, and the shoulds are just driving this conflict and the contempt and the condemnation that goes along with that. All that's just fueling the conflict, right? And what's ironic is, think about this. Everybody wants if just the perfect politician would come along, or another kind of cultural leader can rise up and just give peace. Everybody wants peace. If someone can just make peace. But here's what's ironic. God Himself entered the world thousands of years ago, the righteous one, the perfect man. And what did we do with Him? What do we do with Him? We killed Him. We killed Him. And I can't begin to explain all the different aspects of the significance of that. My limited mind, there's so much to that. But just I want you to think about, just in simplistic terms, like, that's what we did. And you want to talk about like an equalizer? Talk about something that can be potentially unifying, and in reality, and all that God's done is unifying. Let's start there. Everybody, if we had been there, we are capable, whatever our political perspective, whatever side we're on when it comes to that issue, whatever our race, color, creed, I mean, whatever your favorite sports team is, whatever music genre you like more than another genre. I mean, take all those little differences. One thing's the same. We all would have murdered God. You want to talk about equalizing? And look, even as I say it, it's like, wait, what? Like how, really? I mean, I wasn't even there. What are you talking about? But the way the New Testament describes is like every time that sin manifests, that the anxiety, the anger, the frustration, the quarreling, the lust, the judging, I mean, it's all manifestation of my own godhood. My own, I know better. It should be this way. And whoever gets in the way of that, even God himself has to go. And the cross is Jesus coming into the world and saying, hey, look what your condition is. It is where, and I think it's, I don't know, maybe I'm reading this in my mind is significance of the fact that you have a horizontal and a vertical. The coming together, the intersection of God and man on the cross is like God saying, hey, look what you would do to me. Look, see, just be awakened to your condition. See the outpouring of your hate and the outpouring of my love taking place at the same place, at the same time. See that. Everybody is guilty. We're all like, I can't, part of me wants to say, I would never do that. I would be like the disciples, I'd follow. But even with the disciples, you see, when things go badly, they turn on him. Humans, that's what we've got. That's what we're made of. And this event says, hey, God has dealt with it. So the cross is both like, listen, this is fascinating to me. If you look at the cross and God dying on the cross, here's what you see. You see the indictment of the human condition, and you see absolution for the human condition in the same place. We get caught up in how we treat other people, and that's good. We should be aware of. And the New Testament, once again, invites us to be very aware of and very sensitive to how we treat other people, especially because of what it says about our spiritual condition and our need for our Creator. And on the cross, God says, this is where I dealt with it. This is where I provided for your rescue. The gospel is the message everyone needs. Jew, Gentile. Someone on the liberal left, someone on the religious right, the whole spectrum in between, and all of us find ourselves somewhere on that spectrum. All these other things by which we set lines of distinction and battle with other people on the other side. It's the message of the gospel. That's why he says, verse 17, and he came and he preached, peace to you, you Gentiles who were far away, those who were a little farther away, and peace to those who were near. Both needed to hear the message. Even the people near weren't that near. Like, and he uses the temple language in a second here in verse 18. For through him we have access in one spirit to the Father. Remember the temple, and we looked at this in Exodus, and I had slides that we put up on there, and we showed the temple and the way the rooms were built, and you have the outside, the court of women, and you have the court of the Gentiles, and it's like the Gentiles were farther away. But still, when it came to the innermost sanctuary there, the Holy of Holies, that innermost room of the temple, only one person once a year could go in there. That represented like the presence of God, unity with God. It was like this distant reality that just we were invited to like consider, but we still didn't know, how's it going to happen? How do people get access to God? And it's all foreshadowing the coming of Jesus later, where then he comes and he dies, and guess what happens when he dies on the cross? The veil in the temple tears in half from top to bottom. God tears it in half and says, now everybody, Jew, Gentile, everybody come. God had this is, once again, because of what we're caught up in the chaos of our world, hard to believe, but he says, in terms of the warfare problem, God's already solved it. He's already made peace. Everybody in Christ is one in Christ. Whatever your race, socioeconomic level, political perspective, whatever. It's all, you're one in Christ. It's done. So on one hand, there's an opportunity to talk about, okay, how can we better get along? I'm thankful in God's common grace. There are people who are wired in such a way to dig into these things and try to come up with solutions, and that's good. And I think earlier, Don, you prayed for our community, prayed for our state, prayed for our country, prayed for our world. We want to see healing. We want to see peace. And we do get to see that historically, some. But really what we're waiting for is the day when finally God touches down again and peace is established fully forever. And we need him. So one of the things it means to be a Christian is it means I have at least some level of awareness that I can't ultimately fix this. I think a lot of the stress in my life, and probably it's true for you too, you may or may not be aware of it, but when you watch the news, and part of the reason it just feels so intense for you and for me is because on some level it's almost like we feel this little sense of like responsibility, or like what can we do here? As much as that's appropriate to a degree, there's also the aspect of it that just it becomes enslaving, it becomes dark, it becomes hopeless. It is an invitation to remember who God is. The sovereign King, the Prince of Peace, the one who has already settled it all. We're waiting for it to be brought to full fruition, but he has already dealt with it in one historical event. And it's primarily because he's made peace with himself. He's made peace between us and him. The enmity part comes from us. The resolution for the enmity comes from God. The need for rescue, that's our issue. The provision of rescue, that's God's. And the message of the gospel, which is timelessly applicable, is for all who can hear it. Can hear it as good news. Can hear it as a father who has mercy, who sees us, as we talked about earlier, sees us enslaved and miserable and stuck, and who proclaims liberty to captives, who gives sight to the blind. Outpouring of mercy and grace. So, just remind you again, we looked at it last week, but as I wrap it up here, he gives these metaphors of both like a citizenship, which speaks of a nation, that there's one nation, King Jesus. There's this idea of a household where we're all adopted sons and daughters, children of God through Christ. And then there's this idea of a temple, holy dwelling of God. So now it's not a building anymore. We talked about that building, and Jesus says, look, this body, meaning my body, is the temple. And so his physical body, but more so even his spiritual body, of everyone he's united to himself and everyone he's united to God through himself, now is the temple, now is the dwelling place of God. That's the gospel. That's the message of unity. And we all have access. We're all guilty for what happened when God was put to death, and we all have access to God because of that death, where God says, look, I will deal with your problem, even to the extent that I use your hostility toward me to make possible the full provision for your forgiveness, for you to know you're forgiven. That God's love says, even to that point, I mean, let that sink in for a second. Even those of you who pride yourselves in being compassionate to those on the other side of whatever the political issue is, right? Well, okay, I'm trying to be sensitive. I'm trying to be understanding. I kind of do that in my life. I'm trying to understand, okay? But at some point, there's a line. Like, you just can't cross that line. I mean, you attack me enough, you hurt me enough, at some point, it's going to be retaliation. God enters the world through Christ and lets himself go, not just to that point, but like he lets mankind take him way beyond that point because they unjustly execute him, murder him. And we are told that is the outpouring of God's love in the world. So that your Father in heaven is not saying, beating you up, not saying fix it, not saying do something about it. He's just saying, look, I'm just inviting you to look at what I've done for you. I'm just inviting you to look at your condition. Like, soak in that for a little bit. See what you're capable of. You know how, like, so this is the last thing. Go on and on. But, and don't raise your hand. You don't have to, because I know this applies to everybody. You've had those moments in your life where something's happened in your household, maybe a sibling or your spouse or somebody just ticked you off. And something comes out of you where you find yourself saying something, breaking something, whatever. And when the dust settles, you look back like, what the heck was that about? You had that where you're like, wait a minute, where'd that come from? And you realize, wow, I'm glad I'm not that guy all the time. But where does that even come from? So just hear what God says. Naturally, you're at enmity with your Creator. That's where it came from. It's hurt to you. It's hurt to other people. We all know that. And he says, look, I see it for what it is. And it's even my restraining grace that prevents that from happening more often in your life. And Christ came into the world so that you would know that, hey, the loving one, the righteous one has come. It's not you, it's him. He's your substitute. He lived in your place, and he died in your place. And in his death on the cross, he takes upon himself the curse, he takes upon himself the shame, he takes upon himself all of that. He absorbs human hate and pours out divine love. And you're forgiven. And you're still part of my family, God says. And you're one. And I hope that we can experience expressions of that in our lives, and I think that we do. And we do in our church, even though there's plenty of conflict that goes on within our little group too. But we experience that. But the foundation beneath it all is just this is reality for us. And one day, as you said, Don, we're going to be, I think, amazed by what life is like on the other side. It's hard to imagine life without warfare. When you think of all the different levels of expressions of warfare in this world, we were like fighting the elements. I mean, to not be at war in every way, it's going to be amazing. Life and flourishing and, I believe, fun and excitement and all in union with God and with one another, finally. In the meantime, we wait. And we have a message that just keeps anchoring us and grounding us as we wait to get home. So I hope that's encouraging for you. It has been for me. I'll close in prayer here, and we'll be dismissed, okay? All right, let's pray. God, thank you for Ephesians 2 and the reminder this is to us of who we are and who you are. Things that we've considered have been hard to grasp in some ways. Thank you for helping us see the enmity, the distance is primarily between us and you, naturally speaking. And the result, the consequence of that is the horizontal pain, suffering. And then to think that you provided through Christ for us to be reconciled to yourself, for the relationship to be fully restored, invincibly restored. It's truly amazing as we live with these fragile relationships in this world. Thank you for this truth, God. Thank you for the solid ground it is beneath our feet, the anchor it is for us as we wade through really challenging times in our culture. Thankful, God, for the people you brought this morning, and pray that as we go, we would be reminded over and over, and there would be these divine interruptions in our lives to awaken us to what is true, and that would result in humility and gratitude and hope and even peace, some peace in our hearts and minds as we wait for the final redemption of new bodies and new existence and new heaven and new earth and new everything. So thank you for these truths, God. Thank you for making sense of this weird life we are living. Thank you for making sense of it. Thank you for revealing that to us. In Jesus' name.